Well, President Trump says Chicago will likely be the next target of his efforts to crack down on crime, homelessness, and illegal immigration. Today, President Trump indicated the city could get similar treatment to D.C., where he has deployed 2,000 National Guard troops despite 30-year lows in crime. Also this week, the Supreme Court allowed the Trump administration's broad cuts to health grants from the National Institutes of Health as part of Trump's campaign against diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. NIH is a collection of agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services, which receive billions of dollars from Congress to fund medical research. Joining us tonight live to discuss is Erin Carr, Assistant Professor of Law at Seattle University. Erin, thanks for being with us.
Nice to be here with you, Joyce.
Well, let's start with the president's announcement that Chicago could be the next target in his crime crackdown. Legally, does he have the power to do that? And what should we understand about what we see happening there?
As many viewers may be aware, the Trump administration asserted control over the Washington, D.C. police earlier this month, claiming that it was necessary to combat out-of-control crime, even though the city's crime rates had been declining and violent crime now sits at a historic low, according to the Justice Department. Since then, it's become increasingly apparent that the administration's decision to federalize local law enforcement in D.C. may not be intended to be an isolated occurrence. It now appears that the president may be using the takeover of D.C. to pilot larger ambitions to expand federal intervention to other cities that have policies conflicting with those of the administration. And the cities that the administration has targeted, either through comments made by the president or letters sent to state and local officials by the U.S. Attorney General, are notably democratically led and include some of the most liberal, racially diverse cities in the country. Any potential expansion of federal control to cities other than Washington, D.C. would certainly further test the limits of presidential power.
So for cities like Seattle, also liberal leaning, what can cities do about it if it should happen? Like here, is there any legal recourse?
Well, importantly, the cities that the administration is now targeting are not analogous to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is unique. It is a federal enclave where the federal government has much more expansive authority than it does with respect to other major American cities. The administration doesn't have the legal or constitutional authority to take control of city police departments outside of D.C., nor does the president have the power to use the military for civil law enforcement actions in cities. So if the administration were to attempt to replicate what it is currently doing in Washington, D.C., to other cities such as Seattle, it would most certainly be litigated. And at a minimum, I would expect a 10th Amendment challenge arguing that the federal government is constitutionally prohibited from commandeering state and local officials and cannot intervene in state and local legal systems in the manner that the administration appears to be intent on doing.
Well, let's talk about the U.S. Supreme Court, which just derailed efforts to reinstate nearly $2 billion in research grants issued by the National Institutes of Health. That's on top of the president terminating nearly $800 million in NIH grants to DEI programs. Why should we care about that? What's the impact?
The significance of this Supreme Court decision is important for several reasons. First, rulings such as the one that the court recently issued in the NIH litigation has very much come to represent and in many ways characterize the Supreme Court's emergency docket rulings since the Trump administration took office in January. And the court's use of the emergency docket in this way, in a manner that has been incredibly generous to the Trump administration, raises serious concerns about the Supreme Court's own legitimacy as an honest, impartial judicial arbiter. But besides that, there are very real practical consequences that will be felt by all Americans resulting from the gutting of billions of dollars in federal funding for scientific research, health initiatives, education, and countless other social programs that many people benefit from in their day-to-day lives and that are significant economic drivers for many, many communities.
Erin, we have less than a minute left, but I want to ask you this. More and more, it appears that the Trump administration is moving away from democratic norms. As a law professor, are you concerned about that? And do you believe that the American people understand what's happening, and should we be concerned?
Yes, I am deeply concerned with what I consider to be the rapid erosion of key constitutional principles and protections, most notably separation of powers, federalism, basic due process rights. What we have witnessed in the 7 months since President Trump returned to office is the use of declarations of national emergency to justify hundreds of actions, including immigration measures, sweeping tariffs, the dismantling of federal agencies, all of which would typically require congressional approval. I do have faith that American people understand what is happening, but I also appreciate that the flood of activity and disinformation can have a disorienting effect that overwhelm people who are themselves dealing with their own life stressors. But I do want to say that whether future generations have the most fundamental rights and whether our democracy remains intact and recognizable will depend on how we collectively respond in this moment.
Well, from your mouth, to everyone's ears. We hope you're right. Erin Carr, law professor, Seattle University. We appreciate your time tonight and every week. Thank you.